Section 26 of Good Cheer Stories Every Child Should Know. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by kyegrayson. A Thanksgiving Dinner That Flew Away by Hezekiah Butterworth. A Cape Cod story about a wise old gander whose adventure on the sea insured him against the perils of the Thanksgiving hatchet. For boys or girls. There is one sound that I shall always remember. It is honk. I spun around like a top one summer day when I heard it, looking nervously in every direction. I had just come down from the city to the Cape with my sister Hester for my third summer vacation. I had left the cars with my arms full of bundles and hurried toward Aunt Targood's. The cottage stood in from the road. There was a long meadow in front of it. In the meadow were 2 great oaks and some clusters of lilacs. An old mossy stone wall protected the grounds from the road, and a long walk ran from the old wooden gate to the door. It was a sunny day, and my heart was light. The orioles were flaming in the old orchards. The bobolinks were tossing themselves about in the long meadows of timothy, daisies, and patches of clover. There was a scent of new-mown hay in the air. In the distance lay the bay, calm and resplendent, with white sails and specks of boats. Beyond it rose Martha's Vineyard, green and cool and bowery, and at its wharf lay a steamer. I was, as I said, light-hearted. I was thinking of rides over the sandy roads at the close of the long, bright days, of excursions on the bay, of clambakes and picnics. I was hungry, and before me rose visions of Aunt Targood's fish dinners, roast chickens, and berry pies. I was thirsty, but ahead was the old well sweep, and behind the cool lattice of the dairy window were pans of milk in abundance. I tripped on toward the door with light feet, lugging my bundles and beaded with perspiration, but unmindful of all discomforts in the thought of the bright days and good things in store for me. Honk! Honk! My heart gave a bound. Where did that sound come from? Out of a cool cluster of innocent-looking lilac bushes, I saw a dark object cautiously moving. It seemed to have no head. I knew, however, that it had a head. I had seen it. It had seized me once in the previous summer, and I had been in terror of it during all the rest of the season. I looked down into the irregular grass and saw the head and a very long neck running along the ground, propelled by the dark body, like a snake running away from a ball. It was coming toward me, and faster as it approached. I dropped my bundles. In a few flying leaps, I returned to the road again and armed myself with a stick from a pile of cordwood. Honk! 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 It was a call of triumph. The head was high in the air now. My enemy moved grandly forward, as became the monarch of the great meadow farmyard. I stood with beating heart after my retreat. It was Aunt Targood's gander. How he enjoyed his triumph, and how small and cowardly he made me feel. Honk! 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 The geese came out of the lilac bushes, bowing their heads to him in admiration. Then came the goslings, a long progression of awkward, half-feathered things. They appeared equally delighted. The gander seemed to be telling his admiring audience all about it. How a strange lad with many bundles had attempted to cross the yard, how he had driven him back and had captured his bundles, and now was monarch of the field. He clapped his wings when he had finished his heroic story, and sent forth such a honk as might have startled a major general. Then he, with an air of great dignity and coolness, began to examine my baggage. Among my effects were several pounds of chocolate caramels done up in brown paper. Aunt Targood liked caramels, and I brought her a large supply. He tore off the wrappers quickly. He bit one. It was good. He began to distribute the bonbons among the geese, and they, with much liberality and goodwill, among the goslings. This was too much. I ventured through the gate, swinging my cordwood stick. Shoo! He dropped his head on the ground and drove it down the walk in a lively waddle toward me. Shoo! It was Aunt Targood's voice at the door. He stopped immediately. His head was in the air again. Shoo! Out came Aunt Targood with her broom. She always corrected the gander with her broom. If I were to be whipped, I should choose a broom, not the stick. As soon as he beheld the broom, he retired, although with much offended pride and dignity, to the lilac bushes, and the geese and goslings followed him. Hester, you dear child, she said to my sister, come here. I was expecting you and had been looking out for you, but missed sight of you. I had forgotten all about the gander. We gathered up the bundles and the caramels. I was light-hearted again. How cool was the sitting room, with the woodbine falling about the open window. Aunt brought me a pitcher of milk and some strawberries, some bread and honey, and a fan. While I was resting and taking my lunch, I could hear the gander discussing the affairs of the farmyard with the geese. I did not greatly enjoy the discussion. His tone of voice was very proud, and he did not seem to be speaking well of me. I was suspicious that he did not think me a very brave lad. A young person likes to be spoken well of, even by the gander. Aunt Targood's gander had been the terror of many well-meaning people, and of some evildoers, for many years. I have seen tramps and pack peddlers enter the gate and start on toward the door, when there would sound that ringing warning like a war blast, honk, honk, and in a few minutes these unwelcome people would be gone. Farmhouse boarders from the city would sometimes enter the yard, thinking to draw water by the old well sweep. In a few minutes it was customary to hear shrieks and to see women and children flying over the walls, followed by air-rending honks and jubilant cackles from the victorious gander and his admiring family. Aunt Targood sometimes took summer boarders. Among those that I remember was the Reverend Mr. Bonney, a fervent-souled Methodist preacher. He put the gander to flight with the cart whip on the second day after his arrival, and seemingly to Aunt's great grief. But he never was troubled by the feathered tyrant again. Young couples sometimes came to Father Bonney to be married, and one summer afternoon there rode up to the gate a very young couple, whom we afterward learned had run away, or rather had attempted to get married without their parents' approval. The young bridegroom hitched the horse and helped from the carriage the gaily dressed miss he expected to make his wife. They started up the walk upon the run, as though they expected to be followed, and haste was necessary to prevent the failure of their plans. Honk! They stopped. It was a voice of authority. Just look at him, said the bride. Oh! Oh! The bridegroom cried, Shoo! But he might as well have said shoo to a steam engine. On came the gander, with his head and neck upon the ground. He seized the lad by the calf of his leg and made an immediate application of his wings. The latter seemed to think he had been attacked by dragons. As soon as he could shake him off, he ran. So did the bride, but in another direction. And while the two were thus perplexed and discomfited, the bride's father appeared in a carriage and gave her a most forcible invitation to ride home with him. She accepted it without discussion. What became of the bridegroom, or how the matter ended, we never knew. "Aunt, what makes you keep that gander year after year?" said I one evening as we were sitting on the lawn before the door. "Is it because he is a kind of watchdog and keeps troublesome people away?" "No, child, no. I do not wish to keep most people away, not well-behaved people, nor to distress nor annoy anyone. The fact is, there is a story about that gander that I do not like to speak of to everyone. Something that makes me feel tender toward him, so that if he needs a whipping, I would rather do it. He knows something that no one else knows. I could not have him killed or sent away. You have heard me speak of Nathaniel, my oldest boy?" "Yes. That is his picture in my room, you know. He was a good boy to me. He loved his mother. I loved Nathaniel. You cannot think how much I loved Nathaniel. It was on my account that he went away. The farm did not produce enough for us all, Nathaniel, John, and me. We worked hard and had a hard time. One year, that was 10 years ago, we were sued for our taxes. 'Nathaniel,' said I will go to taking boarders.' Then he looked up to me and said, oh, how noble and handsome he appeared to me, 'Mother, I will go to sea.' 'Where?' asked I, in surprise. 'In a coaster.' I turned white. How I felt! 'You and John can manage the place,' he continued. 'One of the vessels sails next week, Uncle Aaron's. He offers to take me.' It seemed best, and he made preparations to go. The spring before, Skipper Ben, you have met Skipper Ben, had given me some goose eggs. He had brought them from Canada and said that they were wild goose eggs. I set them under hens. In 4 weeks I had 3 goslings. I took them into the house at first, but afterward made a pen for them out in the yard. I brought them up myself, and one of those goslings is that gander. Skipper Ben came over to see me the day before Nathaniel was to sail. Aaron came with him. I said to Aaron, 'What can I give Nathaniel to carry to sea with him to make him think of home? Cake? Preserves? Apples? I haven't got much. I've done all I can for him, poor boy.' Brother looked at me curiously and said, 'Give him one of those wild geese, and we will fatten it on shipboard, and we'll have it for our Thanksgiving dinner.' What Brother Aaron said pleased me. The young gander was a noble bird, the handsomest of the lot, and I resolved to keep the geese to kill for my own use, and to give him to Nathaniel. The next morning, it was late in September, I took leave of Nathaniel. I tried to be calm and cheerful and hopeful. I watched him as he went down the walk with the gander struggling under his arms. A stranger would have laughed, but I did not feel like laughing. It was true that the boys who went coasting were usually gone but a few months and came home hearty and happy. But when poverty compels a mother and son to part, after they have been true to each other and shared their feelings in common, it seems hard, though I do not like to murmur or complain at anything allotted to me. I saw him go over the hill. On the top he stopped and held up the gander. He disappeared. Yes, my own Nathaniel disappeared. I think of him now as one who disappeared. November came. It was a terrible month on the coast that year. Storm followed storm. The seafaring people talked constantly of wrecks and losses. I could not sleep on the nights of those high winds. I used to lie awake thinking over all the happy hours that I had lived with Nathaniel. Thanksgiving week came. It was full of an Indian summer brightness after the long storms. The nights were frosty, bright, and calm. I could sleep on those calm nights. One morning I thought I heard a strange sound in the woodland pasture. It was like a wild goose. I listened. It was repeated. I was lying in bed. I started up. I thought I had been dreaming. On the night before Thanksgiving, I went to bed early, being very tired. The moon was full, the air was calm and still. I was still thinking of Nathaniel, and I wondered if he would indeed have the gander for his Thanksgiving dinner, if it would be cooked as well as I would have cooked it, and if he would think of me that day. I was just going to sleep when suddenly I heard a sound that made me start up and hold my breath. Honk! I thought it was a dream, followed by a nervous shock. Honk! Honk! There it was again, in the yard. I was surely awake and in my senses. I heard the geese cackle. Honk! 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 I got out of bed and lifted the curtain. It was almost as light as day. Instead of 2 geese, there were 3. Had one of the neighbor's geese stolen away? I should have thought so, and should not have felt disturbed, but for the reason that none of the neighbor's geese had that peculiar call, that horn-like tone that I had noticed in mine. I went out of the door. The 3rd goose looked like the very gander I had given Nathaniel. Could it be? I did not sleep. I rose early and went to the crib for some corn. It was a gander, a wild gander that had come in the night. He seemed to know me. I trembled all over as though I had seen a ghost. I was so faint that I sat down on the meal chest. As I was in that place, a bill pecked against the door. The door opened. The strange gander came hobbling over the cribstone and went to the corn bin. He stopped there, looked at me, and gave a sort of glad honk, as though he knew me and was glad to see me. I was certain that he was the gander I had raised, and that Nathaniel had lifted into the air when he gave me his last recognition from the top of the hill. It overcame me. It was Thanksgiving. The church bell would soon be ringing as on Sunday, and here was Nathaniel's Thanksgiving dinner and Brother Aaron's. Had it flown away? Where was the vessel? Years have passed. 10. I waited and waited for my boy to come back. December grew dark with its rainy seas. The snows fell. May lighted up the hills, but the vessel never came back. Nathaniel, my Nathaniel, never returned. That gander knows something he could tell me if he could talk. Birds have memories. He remembered the corn crib. He remembered something else. I wish he could talk, poor bird. I wish he could talk. I will never sell him, nor kill him, nor have him abused. He knows. End of section 26.
Section 27 of Good Cheer Stories Every Child Should Know. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eleanor Howard, Greencastle, Indiana. Good Cheer Stories Every Child Should Know by Asa Don Dickinson. Mon-daw-min, or The Origin of Indian Corn, by H.R. Schoolcraft. This is the real Indian fairy tale of the birth of Mon-daw-min. Readers of Longfellow will remember his treatment of the same subject in Hiawatha. In times past, a poor Indian was living with his wife and children in a beautiful part of the country. He was not only poor, but inexpert in procuring food for his family, and his children were all too young to give him assistance. Although poor, he was a man of a kind and contented disposition. He was always thankful to the Great Spirit for everything he received. The same disposition was inherited by his eldest son, who had now arrived at the proper age to undertake the ceremony of the kyegrayson, or fast, to see what kind of spirit would be his guide and guardian through life. Ones, for this was his name, had been an obedient boy from his infancy, and was of a pensive, thoughtful, and mild disposition, so that he was beloved by the whole family. As soon as the first indications of spring appeared, they built him the customary little lodge at a retired spot, some distance from their own, where he would not be disturbed during his solemn rite. In the meantime he prepared himself, and immediately went into it, and commenced his fast. The first few days he amused himself in the mornings by walking in the woods and over the mountains, examining the early plants and flowers, and in this way prepared himself to enjoy his sleep, and at the same time stored his mind with pleasant ideas for his dreams. While he rambled through the woods, he felt a strong desire to know how the plants, herbs, and berries grew without any aid from man, and why it was that some species were good to eat, and others possessed medicinal or poisonous juices. He recalled these thoughts to mind after he became too languid to walk about, and had confined himself strictly to the lodge. He wished he could dream of something that would prove a benefit to his father and family, and to all others. True, he thought, the Great Spirit made all things, and it is to him that we owe our lives, but could he not make it easier for us to get our food than by hunting animals and taking fish? I must try to find out this in my visions. On the third day he became weak and faint, and kept his bed. He fancied, while thus lying, that he saw a handsome young man coming down from the sky, and advancing toward him. He was richly and gaily dressed, having on a great many garments of green and yellow colours, but differing in their deeper or lighter shades. He had a plume of waving feathers on his head, and all his motions were graceful. "I am sent to you, my friend," said the celestial visitor, "by that Great Spirit who made all things in the sky and on the earth. He has seen and knows your motives in fasting. He sees that it is from a kind and benevolent wish to do good to your people, and to procure a benefit for them, and that you do not seek for strength in war or the praise of warriors. I am sent to instruct you, and show you how you can do your kindred good." He then told the young man to arise, and prepare to wrestle with him, as it was only by this means that he could hope to succeed in his wishes. Ones knew he was weak from fasting, but he felt his courage rising in his heart, and immediately got up, determined to die rather than fail. He commenced the trial, and after a protracted effort was almost exhausted when the beautiful stranger said, "My friend, it is enough for once. I will come again to try you." And smiling on him, he ascended in the air in the same direction from which he came. The next day the celestial visitor reappeared at the same hour, and renewed the trial. Ones felt that his strength was even less than the day before, but the courage of his mind seemed to increase in proportion as his body became weaker. Seeing this, the stranger again spoke to him in the same words he used before, adding, "Tomorrow will be your last trial. Be strong, my friend, for this is the only way you can overcome me and obtain the boon you seek." On the third day he again appeared at the same time and renewed the struggle. The poor youth was very faint in body, but grew stronger in mind at every contest, and was determined to prevail or perish in the attempt. He exerted his utmost powers, and after the contest had been continued the usual time, the stranger ceased his efforts and declared himself conquered. For the first time he entered the lodge, and sitting down beside the youth he began to deliver his instructions to him, telling him in what manner he should proceed to take advantage of his victory. "You have won your desires of the Great Spirit," said the stranger. "You have wrestled manfully. Tomorrow will be the 7th day of your fasting. Your father will give you food to strengthen you, and as it is the last day of trial, you will prevail. I know this, and now tell you what you must do to benefit your family and your tribe. Tomorrow," he repeated, "I shall meet you and wrestle with you for the last time, and as soon as you have prevailed against me, you will strip off my garments and throw me down, clear the earth of roots and weeds, make it soft, and bury me in the spot. When you have done this, leave my body in the earth and do not disturb it, but come occasionally to visit the place, to see whether I have come to life, and be careful never to let the grass or weeds grow on my grave. Once a month cover me with fresh earth. If you follow my instructions, you will accomplish your object of doing good to your fellow creatures by teaching them the knowledge I now teach you." He then shook him by the hand and disappeared. In the morning the youth's father came with some slight refreshments, saying, "My son, you have fasted long enough. If the Great Spirit will favour you, he will do it now. It is 7 days since you have tasted food, and you must not sacrifice your life. The Master of Life does not require that." "My father," replied the youth, "wait until the sun goes down. I have a particular reason for extending my fast to that hour." "Very well," said the old man. "I shall wait till the hour arrives, and you feel inclined to eat." At the usual hour of the day the sky visitor returned, and the trial of strength was renewed. Although the youth had not availed himself of his father's offer of food, he felt that new strength had been given to him, and that exertion had renewed his strength and fortified his courage. He grasped his angelic antagonist with supernatural strength, threw him down, took from him his beautiful garments and plume, and finding him dead, immediately buried him on the spot, taking all the precautions he had been told of, and being very confident at the same time that his friend would again come to life. He then returned to his father's lodge, and partook sparingly of the meal that had been prepared for him. But he never for a moment forgot the grave of his friend. He carefully visited it throughout the spring, and weeded out the grass, and kept the ground in a soft and pliant state. Very soon he saw the tops of the green plumes coming through the ground, and the more careful he was to obey his instructions in keeping the ground in order, the faster they grew. He was, however, careful to conceal the exploit from his father. Days and weeks had passed in this way. The summer was now drawing toward a close, when one day, after a long absence in hunting, Ones invited his father to follow him to the quiet and lonesome spot of his former fast. The lodge had been removed, and the weeds kept from growing on the circle where it stood, but in its place stood a tall and graceful plant, with bright-coloured silken hair, surmounted with nodding plumes and stately leaves, and golden clusters on each side. "It is my friend," shouted the lad. "It is the friend of all mankind. It is Mon-daw-min. We need no longer rely on hunting alone, for as long as this gift is cherished and taken care of, the ground itself will give us a living." He then pulled an ear. "See, my father," said he, "this is what I fasted for. The Great Spirit has listened to my voice, and sent us something new, and henceforth our people will not alone depend upon the chase or upon the waters." He then communicated to his father the instructions given him by the stranger. He told him that the broad husks must be torn away, as he had pulled off the garments in his wrestling, and having done this, directed him how the ear must be held before the fire till the outer skin became brown, while all the milk was retained in the grain. The whole family then united in feast on the newly grown ears, expressing gratitude to the merciful spirit who gave it. So corn came into the world. End of Mon-daw-min, or the Origin of Indian Corn.
Section 28 of Good Cheer Stories Every Child Should Know. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by kyegrayson. A Mystery in the Kitchen by Olive Thorne Miller. The boy who has a sister and the girl who has a brother are the ones who will best like this story of the spirited twins Jessie and Jack. Jessie wanted to take music lessons, and Jack tried mining in Colorado. Something very mysterious was going on in the Jarvis kitchen. The table was covered with all sorts of good things, eggs and butter and raisins and citron and spices, and Jessie, with her sleeves rolled up and a white apron on, was bustling about, measuring and weighing and chopping and beating and mixing those various ingredients in a most bewildering way. Moreover, though she was evidently working for dear life, her face was full of smiles. In fact, She seemed to have trouble to keep from laughing outright, while Betty, the cook, who was washing potatoes at the sink, fairly giggled with glee every few minutes, as if the sight of Miss Jessie working in the kitchen was the drollest thing in the world. It was one of the pleasantest sights that big sunny kitchen had seen for many a day, and the only thing that appeared mysterious about it was that the two workers acted strangely like conspirators. If they laughed, as they did on the slightest provocation, it was very soft and at once smothered. Jessie went often to the door leading into the hall and listened, and if there came a knock on the floor, she snatched off her apron, hastily wiped her hands, rolled down her sleeves, asked Betty if there was any flour on her, and then hurried away into another part of the house, trying to look cool and quiet, as if she had not been doing anything. On returning from one of these excursions, as she rolled up her sleeves again, she said, "Betty, we must open the other window if it is cold. Mamma thought she smelled roast turkey." Betty burst into a laugh, which she smothered in her apron. Jessie covered her mouth and laughed too, but the window was opened to make a draught and carry out the delicious odors, which, it must be confessed, did fill that kitchen so full that no wonder they crept through the cracks and the keyholes and hung about Jessie's dress as she went through the hall in a way to make one's mouth water. "What did you tell her?" asked Betty as soon as she could speak. "Oh, I told her I thought pot pie smelled a good deal like turkey," said Jessie, and again both laughed. "Wasn't it lucky we had pot pie today? I don't know what I should have said if we hadn't." Well, it was not long after that when Jessie lined a baking dish with nice-looking crust, filled it with tempting-looking chicken legs and wings and breasts and backs and a bowl full of broth, laid a white blanket of crust over all, tucked it in snugly around the edge, cut some holes in the top, and shoved it into the oven just after Betty drew out a dripping pan in which reposed, in all the glory of rich brown skin, a beautiful turkey. Mrs. Jarvis couldn't have had any nose at all if she didn't smell that. It filled the kitchen full of nice smells, and Betty hurried it into the pantry where the window was open to cool. Then Jessie returned to the spices and fruits she had been working over so long, and a few minutes later she poured a rich, dark mass into a tin pudding dish, tied the cover on tight, and slipped it into a large kettle of boiling water on the stove. "There," she said. "I hope that'll be good." "I know it will," said Betty confidently. "That's your ma's best recipe." "Yes, but I've never made it before," said Jessie doubtfully. "Oh, I know it'll be all right. Now watch it close," said Betty. "Now you go and sit with your ma. I want that table to get dinner." "But I'm going to wash all these things," said Jessie. "You go long. I'd rather do that myself. 'Twon't take me no time," said Betty. Jessie hesitated. "But you have enough to do, Betty." "I tell you I want to do it," the girl insisted. "Oh, I know," said Jessie. "You like to help about it. Well, you may, and I'm much obliged to you besides." And after a last look at the fine turkey cooling his heels, if he had any, in the pantry, Jessie went into the other part of the house. When dinner time arrived and Papa came from town, there duly appeared on the table the pot pie, before mentioned, and various other things pleasant to eat. But nothing was seen of the turkey so carefully roasted, nor of the chicken pie, nor of the pudding that caused the young cook so much anxiety. Nothing was said about them either, and it was not Thanksgiving nor Christmas, though it was only a few days before the former. It was certainly odd, and stranger things happened that night. In the first place, Jessie sat up in her room and wrote a letter, and then, after her mother was in bed and everything still, she stole down the back stairs with a candle, quietly, as though she was doing some mischief. Betty, who came down to help her, brought a box in from the woodshed, and the two plotters, very silently, with many listenings at the door to see if anyone was stirring, packed that box full of good things. In it, the turkey, wrapped in a snowy napkin, found a bed. The chicken pie and the plum pudding, beautiful looking as Betty said it would be, bore him company, and numerous small things, jam jars, fruits, etc., etc., filled the box to its very top. Then the cover, provided with screws so that no hammering need be done, was fastened on. "Now you go to bed, Miss Jessie," whispered Betty. "I'll wait." "No, you must be tired," said Jessie. "I'd just as lief." "But I'd ruther," said Betty shortly, "and I'm going to. It won't be long now." So Jessie crept quietly upstairs, and before long there was a low rap on the kitchen door. Betty opened it, and there stood a man. "Ready?" said he. "Yes," answered Betty, "but don't speak loud. Miss Jarvis has sharp ears, and we don't want her disturbed. Here's the card to mark it by." And she produced a card from the table. The man put it in his pocket, shouldered the box, and Betty shut the door. Not one of those good things ever went into the Jarvis dining room. The next morning things went on just as usual in the house. The kitchen door was left open, and Mrs. Jarvis was welcome to smell any of the appetizing odors that wafted out into her room. Jessie resumed her study, and especially her practice, for she hoped some day to be a great musician. She waited on her mother and took charge of the housekeeping, so much as was necessary with the well-tried servant at the head of the kitchen. And, though she had but 16 years over her bright brown head, she proved herself to be what in that little New England town was called capable. But that box of goodies! Let us see where it went. It was Thanksgiving morning in a rough-looking little mining settlement in Colorado. In a shanty, rougher and more comfortless than the rest, were two persons. One, a man of 30, was deeply engaged in cleaning and oiling a gun which lay in pieces about him on the rough bench where he sat. The other, a youth of 16, was trying to make a fire burn in the primitive-looking affair that did duty as a stove. Both wore coarse miner's suits, and picks and other things about the room told that their business was to dig for the yellow dust we are all so greedy to have. Evidently luck had not been good, for the whole place appeared run down, and the two looked absolutely hungry. It was Thanksgiving morning, as I said, but no thankfulness shone in the two pale, thin faces. Both were sad, and the younger one almost hopeless. "Jack," said the elder, pausing in his operations, "mind you give that old hen a good boil, or we won't be able to eat it." "It'll be better'n nothing anyway, I suppose," said Jack gloomily. "Not much, especially if you don't get the taste of sagebrush out of it. Lucky I happened to get that shot at her anyway," he went on. "I've seen worse dinners, even Thanksgiving dinners, than a sage hen." "I haven't," said Jack shortly, for the mention of Thanksgiving had brought up before him with startling vividness the picture of a bright dining room in a certain town far away, a table loaded with good things and surrounded by smiling faces, and the contrast was almost more than he could bear. "Well, don't be down on your luck, boy, so long as you can get a good fat hen to eat, if she does happen to be too fond of seasoning before she's dead," replied the other cheerfully. "We haven't struck it yet, but it's always darkest just before dawn, you know. We may be millionaires before this time tomorrow." "We may," answered Jack, but he didn't look as if he had much hope of it. A few hours later, the occupants of the cabin sat down to their Thanksgiving dinner. It consisted of the hen aforesaid, cut in pieces and boiled, looking very queer too, served in the kettle in which the operation had been performed. The table was at one end of the bench, the table service, 2 jackknives and 2 iron spoons. Absolutely nothing else. The elder sat on the bench, the younger drew up a keg that had held powder, and the dinner was about to begin. But that hen was destined never to be eaten, for just at that moment the door was pushed open in the rude way of the country, a box set down on the floor, and a rough voice announced, "A box for Mr. Jack Jones." Jack started up. "For me? There must be a mistake. Nobody knows—" He stopped, for he had not mentioned that his name was assumed. "Likely not," said the man, with a knowing look, "but folks has a mighty queer way of finding out." And he shut the door and left. Jack stood staring at the box as if he had lost his wits. It could not be from home, for no one knew where he went when he stole out of the house one night 6 months ago and ran away to seek his fortune. Not a line had he ever written, not even when very ill, as he had been, not even when without a roof to cover his head, as he had been more than once, not even when he had not eaten for 2 days, as also, alas, had been his experience. He had deliberately run away because, how trivial it looked to him now, and how childish seemed his conduct, because he thought his father too hard on him, would not allow him enough liberty, wanted to dictate to this man of 16. He intended to show him that he could get on alone. Poor Jack! The only comfort he had been able to extract from his hard lot these many months of wandering, of work, of suffering such as he had never dreamed of, his only comfort was that his tender mother didn't know. His only sister would no more be worried by his grumbling and complaints, and his father would be convinced now that he wasn't a baby. Small comfort, too, to balance the hardships that had fallen to his lot since the money he had drawn from the savings bank, his little all, was used up. "Why don't you open it?" The gruff but not unkind voice of his roommate, whom he called Tom, aroused him. "Maybe there's something in it better than sage hen," trying to raise a smile. But no smile followed. Mechanically, Jack sought the tools to open it, and in a few moments the cover was off. It was from home! On the very top was a letter addressed to Jack Jarvis in a hand that he well knew. He hastily stuffed it into his pocket unopened. The layers of paper were removed, and as each one was thrown off, something new appeared. Not a word was spoken, but the kettle of sage hen was silently put on the floor by Tom as the bench began to fill up. A jar of cranberry sauce, another of orange marmalade, oranges and apples, a plum pudding, a chicken pie, and lastly, in its white linen wrapper, the turkey we saw browning in that far-off New England kitchen. As one by one these things were lifted out and placed on the bench, a deep silence reigned in the cabin. Jack had choked at sight of the letter, and memories of days far different from these checked even Tom's usually lively tongue. A strange unpacking it was. How different from the joyful packing at dead of night with those 2 laughing girl faces bending over it. When all was done and the silence grew painful, Jack blurted out, "Help yourself!" and bustled about, busily gathering up the papers and folding them and stuffing them back in the box as though he were the most particular housekeeper in the world. But if Jack couldn't eat, something too ailed Tom. He said simply, "Don't feel hungry. Believe I'll go out and see what I can find." And, shouldering his gun, now cleaned and put together, he quickly went out and shut the door. Jack sat down on the keg and looked at the things which so vividly brought home and his happy life there before him. He did not feel hungry either. He sat and stared for some time. Then he remembered his letter. He drew it from his pocket and opened it. It was very thick, and when he pulled it out of the envelope, the first thing he saw was the smiling face of his sister Jessie, his twin sister, his playmate and comrade, his confidant from the cradle. The loss of her ever-willing sympathy had been almost more to him than all the rest of his troubles. This was another shock that brought something to his eyes that made him see the others through a mist. There were the pictures of his mother, whose gentle voice he could almost hear, and of his father, whose gray hairs and sad face he suddenly remembered were partly his work. At last he read the letter. It began, "Dear Jack, I've just found out where you are, and I'm so glad. I send you this Thanksgiving dinner. It was too bad for you to go off so. You don't know how dreadful it was for Mama. She was sick a long time, and we were scared to death about her, but she's better now. She can sit up most all day." "Oh, Jack, Father cried. I'm sure he did, and he almost ran out of the room, and didn't say anything to anybody all day. But I was determined I'd find you. I shan't tell you how I did it, but Uncle John helped me, and now, Jack, he says he wants just such a fellow as you to learn his business, and he'll make you a very good offer. And, Jack, that's my turkey, my Winnie, and nobody but Betty knows anything about this box and this letter. I send you all my money out of the savings bank. I didn't tell anybody that. And I want you to come home. You'll find the money under the cranberries. I thought it would be safe there, and I knew you'd eat them all. You're so fond of cranberries. I didn't tell anybody because I want to surprise them. And besides, let them think you came home because you got ready. It's nobody's business where you got the money anyway. Now do come right home, Jack. You can get here in a week's time, I know. Your affectionate sister, Jessie." Jack laid the letter down with a rush of new feelings and thoughts that had overwhelmed him. He sat there for hours. He knew nothing of time. He had mechanically turned the cranberry jar upside down and taken from the bottom, carefully wrapped in white paper, $50. A pang went through him. Well did he know what that money represented to his sister. By how many sacrifices she had been saving it for a year or two, with the single purpose of taking the lessons from a great master that were to fit her to teach, to take an independent position in the world, to relieve her father, who had lost a large slice of his comfortable income, and who was growing old and sad under his burden. She had often talked it over with Jack. Now she had generously given up the whole to him, all her hopes and dreams of independence, and he who should have been the support of his sister, the right arm of his father, he had basely deserted. These thoughts and many more surged through his mind that long afternoon, and when Tom returned as the shadows were growing long, he sat exactly as he had been left. On Tom's entrance he roused himself. There was a new light in his eye. "Come, Tom," he said. "Dinner's waiting. You must be hungry by this time." "I am that," said Tom, who had been through his own mental struggles meanwhile. The two sat down once more to their Thanksgiving dinner, and this time they managed to eat, though Jack choked whenever he thought of tasting a bit of Jessie's pet turkey, Winnie, and much as he liked turkey, and a home turkey at that, he could not touch it. After the meal, when the provisions were stored away in the cupboard, a soap box, much too small for such a supply, it had grown quite dark, and the two, still disinclined to talk, went to their beds, if the rough bunks they occupied may be dignified by that name, but not to sleep, at least not Jack, who tumbled and tossed all night and got up in the morning with an energy and life he had not shown for weeks. After breakfast, Tom shouldered his pick and said, "I'll go on, Jack, while you clear up." Yet he felt in his heart he should never see Jack again, for there was a home-struck look in his face that the man of experience in the ways of runaway boys knew well. He was not surprised that Jack did not join him, nor that when he returned at night to the cabin he found him gone and a note pinned up on the door. "I can't stand it. I'm off for home. You may have my share of everything. Jack." It was a cold evening in early December, and there seemed to be an undercurrent of excitement in the Jarvis household. The table was spread in the dining room with the best silver and linen. Mrs. Jarvis was better, and had even been able to go into the kitchen to superintend the preparations for dinner. Jessie went around with a shining face that no one understood, and she could not explain. Betty was strangely nervous and had made several blunders that morning which mortified the faithful servant very much. An air of expectancy pervaded the whole house, though the two heads of it had not a hint of the cause. Jessie heard the train she had decided to be the important one. She could hardly contain herself for expectation. She tried hard to sober herself now and then by the thought, perhaps he won't come. But she couldn't stay sobered, for she felt as certain that he would as that she lived. You all know how it happened. The door opened, and Jack walked in. One instant of blank silence, and then a grand convulsion. Jack fell on his knees with his face in his mother's lap, though he had not thought a moment before of doing any such thing. Jessie hung over him, frantically hugging him. Mr. Jarvis, vainly trying to join this group, could only lay his hands on Jack's head and say in a broken voice, "My son, my son," while Betty performed a war dance around the party, wildly brandishing a basting spoon in one hand and wiping her streaming eyes on the dishcloth which she held in the other. It was long before a word could be spoken, and the dinner was totally ruined, as Betty declared with tears, though they were not for sorrow, before anyone could calm down enough to eat. Then the reaction set in, and justice was done to the dinner, while talk went on in a stream. Jack did not tell his adventures. He only said that he had come from the city, where he had made arrangements for a situation with Uncle John, at which Jessie's eyes sparkled. His looks, even after a week of comfort and hope, spoke for his sufferings. There is little more to tell. Jack Jarvis at 17 was a different boy from the Jack who at 16 started out to seek his fortune. You may be sure that Jessie had her music lessons after all, and that a new Winnie with a fine young brood at her heels stalked about the Jarvis grounds the next spring. End of section 28.
Section 29 of Good Cheer Stories Every Child Should Know. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recording by anjpatel. Good Cheer Stories Every Child Should Know by Asa Don Dickinson. Who Ate the Dolly's Dinner by Isabel Gordon Curtis. A good story for the big sister to read the little boys and girls. Why can't dollies have a Thanksgiving dinner as well? As real folks, asked Polly Pine. I don't know why, said Mama, laughing. Go and dress them in their best clothes, get the doll's house swept and dusted and the table ready. Then I'll fix their dinner before we go downstairs. Oh, how nice, said Polly Pine. The doll house stood in the nursery. It was very big and very beautiful. It was painted red, it had tall chimneys, and a fine front door with Our Bliss on a brass plate. There were lace curtains at the windows, and 2 steps led up to the cunning little piazza. Polly Pine swept the rooms with her tiny broom and dusted them. Then she set the table in the dining room, with the very best dishes and the finest silver. She set a teeny vase in the middle of the table, with 2 violets in it, and she put dolly table napkins at each place. When the house was all nice and clean, she dressed Lavinia in her pink muslin, and Dora Jane in her grey velvet, and Hannah Welch in her yellow silk. Then she seated them around the table, each one in her own chair. Polly was just telling them about company manners, how they must not eat with their knives, or leave their teaspoons in their cups when they drank their tea. When the door opened and in came Mama with a real doll's Thanksgiving dinner. There was a chicken bone to put on the platter before Hannah Welch, for Hannah always did the carving. There were cunning little dishes of mashed potato and cranberry sauce and some celery in a tiny tumbler, and the smallest squash pie baked in a patty pan. Polly Pine just hopped up and down with delight when she saw it. She set everything on the table, then she ran away to put on her nicest muslin frock with the pink ribbons, and she went downstairs to her own dinner. There were gentlemen there for dinner, gentlemen Polly was very fond of, and she had a nice time visiting one of them. He could change his table napkin into a white rabbit, and she forgot all about the dolls' Thanksgiving dinner until it was dessert time and the nuts and raisins came in. Then Polly remembered, and she jumped down from her chair and asked Mama if she might go upstairs and see if the dolls had eaten their dinner. When Mama told about the dollhouse Thanksgiving, all the family wanted to go too, to find out if the dolls had enjoyed their dinner. The front door of the dollhouse was open, and there sat the dolls just as their mistress had left them. Only they had eaten nearly all the dinner. Everything was gone except the potato and the cranberry sauce. The chicken leg was picked bare, the bread was nibbled, and the little pie was eaten all around. "Well, this is funny," said Papa. Just then they heard a funny scratching noise in the dollhouse, and a little grey mouse jumped out from under the table. He ran out the front door of the dollhouse and over the piazza and down the steps before you could say Jack Robinson. In a minute he was gone, nobody knew where. There was another tiny mouse in the dollhouse under the parlour sofa, and a third one under Lavinia's bed, with a poor frightened grey tail sticking out. They all got away safe. Papa would not allow Mama to go for the cat, he said. Why can't a poor little mouse have a Thanksgiving dinner as well as we? End of Who Ate the Dolly's Dinner by Isabel Gordon Curtis. Recording by anjpatel.
Section 30 of Good Cheer Stories Every Child Should Know. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Georgann Fennell, Sun City West, Arizona. Good Cheer Stories Every Child Should Know by Asa Don Dickinson. An Old-Fashioned Thanksgiving by Rose Terry Cooke. A long story about a family of hardy New England pioneers in Revolutionary days. It would be most enjoyed by the older children.
"Pile in, Hannah. Get right down long of the clock so's to kinder shore her up. I'll fixin' them pillars to the other side on it, and you can set back against the bed. Goodbye, folks. Gee up. Bright gee, I tell you, Buck."
"Goodbye," nodded Hannah from the depths of the old calash which Granny had given her for a riding hood, and her rosy face sparkled under the green shadow like a blossom under a burdock leaf. This was their wedding journey, 30 long miles to be traveled at the slow pace of an ox cart, where today a railroad spins by, and a log hut in the dim distance. But Hannah did not cry about it. There was a momentary choking, perhaps, in her throat as she caught a last view of Granny's mob cap and her father's rough face, with the red head of her small step-brother between them, grouped in the doorway. Her mother had died long ago, and there was another in her place now, and a swarm of children. Hannah was going to her own home, to a much easier life, and going with John. Why should she cry? Besides, Hannah was the merriest little woman in the country. She had a laugh always lying ready in a convenient dimple. She never knew what blues meant, except to dye stocking yarn. She was sunny as a dandelion and gay as a bobolink. Her sweet good nature never failed through the long day's journey, and when night came she made a pot of tea at the campfire, roasted a row of apples, and broiled a partridge John shot by the wayside, with as much enjoyment as if this was the merriest picnic excursion, and not a solitary camp in the forest, long miles away from any human dwelling, and by no means sure of safety from some lingering savage, some beast of harmful nature, or at least a visit from a shambling black bear, for bears were plentiful enough in that region. But none of these things worried Hannah. She ate her supper with hearty appetite, said her prayers with John, and curled down on the feather bed in the cart, while John heaped on more wood, and shouldering his musket, went to lengthen the ropes that tethered his oxen, and then mounted guard over the camp. Hannah watched his fine, grave face as the flickering light illuminated it for a few minutes, and then slept tranquilly till dawn. And by sunset the next day the little party drew up at the door of the log hut they called home. It looked very pretty to Hannah. She had the fairy gift that is so rare among mortals, of seeing beauty in its faintest expression. And the young grass about the rough stone doorstep, the crimson cones on the great larch tree behind it, the sunlit panes of the west window, the laugh and sparkle of the brook that ran through the clearing, the blue eyes of the squirrel caps that blossomed shyly and daintily beside the stumps of new-felled trees, all these she saw and delighted in. And when the door was open, the old clock set up, the bed laid on the standing bed-place, and the 3 chairs and table arranged against the wall, she began her housewifery directly, singing as she went. Before John had put his oxen in the small barn, sheltered the cart and the tools in it, and shaken down hay into the manger, Hannah had made a fire, hung on the kettle, spread up her bed with homespun sheets and blankets, and a wonderful cover of white and red chintz, set the table with a loaf of bread, a square of yellow butter, a bowl of maple sugar, and a plate of cheese, and even released the cock and the hen from their uneasy prison in a splint basket, and was feeding them in the little woodshed when John came in. His face lit up as he entered, with that joyful sense of home so instinctive in every true man and woman. He rubbed his hands together, and catching Hannah as she came in at the shed door, bestowed upon her a resounding kiss.
"You're the most of a little woman I ever see, Hannah, I sworn to man."
Hannah laughed like a swarm of spring blackbirds. "I declare, John, you do beat all. Ain't it real pleasant here? Seems to me I never saw things so handy." "Oh, Hannah, what if your prophetic soul could have foreseen the conveniences of this 100 years after? Yet the shelves, the pegs, the cupboard in the corner, the broad shelf above the fire, the great pine chest under the window, and the clumsy settle, all wrought out of pine board by John's patient and skilful fingers, filled all her needs, and what can modern conveniences do more?" So they ate their supper at home for the first time, happy as new-nested birds, and far more grateful. John had built a sawmill on the brook a little way from the house, and already owned a flourishing trade. For the settlement about the lake from which Nepasset Brook sprung was quite large, and until John Perkins went there, the lumber had been all drawn 15 miles off to Litchfield, and his mill was only 3 miles from Nepash village. Hard work and hard fare lay before them both, but they were not daunted by the prospect. By and by a cradle entered the door, and a baby was laid in it. One baby is well enough in a log cabin with one room for all the purposes of life, but when next year brought 2 more, a pair of stout boys, then John began to saw lumber for his own use. A bedroom was built on the east side of the house, and a rough stairway into the loft, more room perhaps than was needed, but John was called in Nepash a dreadful forecasting man, and he took warning from the twins, and timely warning it proved, for as the years slipped by one after another, they left their arrows in his quiver, till 10 children bloomed about the hearth. The old cabin had disappeared entirely. A good-sized frame house of 1 story, with a high-pitched roof, stood in its stead, and a slab fence kept roving animals out of the yard and saved the apple trees from the teeth of stray cows and horses. Poor enough they were still. The loom in the garret always had its web ready. The great wheel by the other window sung its busy song year in and year out. Dolly was her mother's right hand now, and the twins, Ralph and Reuben, could fire the musket and chop wood. Sylvie, the 4th child, was the odd one. All the rest were sturdy, rosy, laughing girls and boys. But Sylvie had been a pining baby, and grew up into a slender, elegant creature, with clear gray eyes, limpid as water, but bright as stars, and fringed with long golden lashes the color of her beautiful hair, locks that were coiled in fold on fold at the back of her fine head, like wreaths of undyed silk, so pale was their yellow luster. She bloomed among the crowd of red-cheeked, dark-haired lads and lasses, stately and incongruous as a June lily in a bed of tulips. But Sylvie did not stay at home. The parson's lady at Lichfield came to Nepish one Sunday with her husband, and seeing Sylvie in the square corner pew with the rest, was mightily struck by her lovely face, and offered to take her home with her the next week, for the better advantages of schooling. Hannah could not have spared Dolly, but Sylvia was a dreamy, unpractical child, and though all the dearer for being the solitary lamb of the flock, by virtue of her essential difference from the rest, still, for that very reason, it became easier to let her go. Parson Everett was childless, and in 2 years' time both he and his wife adored the gentle, graceful girl, and she loved them dearly. They could not part with her, and at last adopted her formally as their daughter, with the unwilling consent of John and Hannah. Yet they knew it was greatly for Sylvie's betterment, as they phrased it, so at last they let her go. But when Dolly was a sturdy young woman of 25, the war trumpet blew, and John and the twins heard it effectually. There was a sudden leaving of the plough in the furrow. The planting was set aside for the children to finish, the old musket rubbed up, and with set lips and resolute eyes the 3 men walked away one May morning to join the Nepish company. Hannah kept up her smiling courage through it all. If her heart gave way, nobody knew it but God and John. The boys she encouraged and inspired, and the children were shamed out of their childish tears by mother's bright face and cheery talk. Then she set them all to work. There was corn to plant, wheat to sow, potatoes to set, flax and wool to spin and weave, for clothes would be needed for all, both absent and stay-at-homes. There was no father to superintend the outdoor work, so Hannah took the field and marshaled her forces on Nepasset Brook, much as the commander-in-chief was doing on a larger scale elsewhere. Eben, the biggest boy, and Joey, who came next him, were to do all the planting. Diana and Sam took on themselves the care of the potato patch, the fowls, and the cow. Dolly must spin and weave when mother left either the wheel or loom to attend to the general ordering of the forces, while Obed and Betty, the younglings of the flock, were detailed to weed, pick vegetables, such few as were raised in the small garden, gather berries, herbs, nuts, hunt the straying turkeys' nests, and make themselves generally useful. At evening all the girls sewed. The boys mended their shoes, having learned so much from a traveling cobbler, and the mother taught them all her small stock of schooling would allow. At least they each knew how to read, and most of them to write, after a very uncertain fashion. As to spelling, nobody knew how to spell in those days. But they did know the 4 simple rules of arithmetic, and could say the epigrammatic rhymes of the old New England primer, and the Sibyllic formulas of the Assembly's catechism as glibly as the child of today repeats the house that Jack built. So the summer went on. The corn tasseled, the wheat ears filled well, the potatoes hung out rich clusters of their delicate and graceful blossoms, beans straggled half over the garden, the hens did their duty bravely, and the cow produced a heifer calf. Father and the boys were fighting now, and mother's merry words were more rare, though her bright face still wore its smiling courage. They heard rarely from the army. Now and then a post-rider stopped at the Nepish tavern and brought a few letters or a little news, but this was at long intervals, and women who watched and waited at home without constant mail service and telegraphic flashes, aware that news of disaster, of wounds, of illness could only reach them too late to serve or save, and that to reach the ill or the dying involved a larger and more disastrous journey than the survey of half the world demands now. These women endured pangs beyond our comprehension, and endured them with a courage and patience that might have furnished forth an army of heroes, that did go far to make heroes of that impoverished, ill-conditioned, eager multitude who conquered the trained bands of their oppressors and set their sons free and equal, to use their own dubious phraseology, before the race of humanity at large. By and by winter came on with all its terrors. By night wolves howled about the lonely house and sprung back over the palings when Eben went to the door with his musket. Joe hauled wood from the forest on a hand sled, and Dolly and Diana took it in through the kitchen window when the drifts were so high that the woodshed door could not be opened. Besides, all the hens were gathered in there, as well for greater warmth as for convenience in feeding, and the barn was only to be reached with snowshoes and entered by the window above the manger. Hard times these were. The loom in the garret could not be used, for even fingers would freeze in that atmosphere, so the thread was wound off, twisted on the great wheel, and knit into stockings, the boys learning to fashion their own, while Hannah knit her anxiety and her hidden heartaches into socks for her soldier boys and their father. By another spring the aching and anxiousness were a little dulled, for habit blunts even the keen edge of mortal pain. They had news that summer that Ralph had been severely wounded, but had recovered, that John had gone through a sharp attack of camp fever, that Reuben was taken prisoner, but escaped by his own wit. Hannah was thankful and grateful beyond expression. Perhaps another woman would have wept and wailed to think all this had come to pass without her knowledge or her aid. But it was Hannah's way to look at the bright side of things. Sylvia would always remember how once, when she was looking at Mount Taconic darkened by a brooding tempest, its crags frowning blackly above the dark forest at its foot, and the lurid cloud above its head torn by fierce lances of light, she hid her head in her mother's checked apron, in the helpless terror of an imaginative child. But instead of being soothed and pitied, Mother had only laughed a little gay laugh, and said gently but merrily, "Why, Sylvie, the sun's right on the other side, only you don't see it." After that she always thought her mother saw the sun when nobody else could, and in a spiritual sense it was true. Parson Everett rode over once or twice from Litchfield that next summer to fetch Sylvia and to administer comfort to Hannah. He was a quaint, prim little gentleman, neat as any wren, but mild-mannered as wrens never are, and in a moderate way kindly and sympathetic. When the children had haled their lovely sister away to see their rustic possessions, Parson Everett would sit down in a high chair, lay aside his cocked hat, spread his silk pocket handkerchief over his knees, and prepare to console Hannah.
"Mistress Perkins, these are trying times, trying times. There is a sound of a going in the tops of the mulberry trees. Sea and waves roaring of a truth. I trust, Mistress Perkins, you submit to the divine will with meekness."
"Well, I don't know," replied Hannah with a queer little twinkle in her eye. "I don't believe I be as meek as Moses, parson. I should like things fixed different, to speak truth."
Dear me, dear me, my good woman, the Lord reigneth. You must submit, you must submit. You know it is the duty of a vessel of wrath to be broken to pieces if it glorifieth the Maker."
"Well, maybe 'tis. I don't know much about that kind of vessel. I've got to submit because there ain't anything else to do, as I see. I can't say it goes easy, not and be honest, but I try to look on the bright side and to believe the Lord'll take care of my folks better'n I could, even if they was here."
"Well," stammered the embarrassed parson, completely at his wits' end with this cheerful theology. "Well, I hope it is grace that sustains you, Mistress Perkins, and not the vain elation of the natural man. The Lord is in his holy temple. The earth is his footstool." The parson struggled helplessly with a tangle of texts here, but the right one seemed to fail him, till Hannah audaciously put it in.
"Well, you know what it says about taking care of sparrows in the Bible, and how we was more valuable than they be, a lot. That kind of text comes home these times, I tell ye. You fetch your person down to the bedrock, as Grandsir Penlyn used to say, and then they know where they be. And if the Lord is really the Lord of all, I expect he'll take care of all, and I don't doubt but what he is and does, so I can fetch up on that."
Parson Everett heaved a deep sigh, put on his cocked hat, and blew his nose ceremonially with the silk handkerchief. Not that he needed to, but as a sort of shaking off of the dust of responsibility and ending the conversation, which, if it was not heterodox on Hannah's part, certainly did not seem orthodox to him. He did not try to console her any more, but contented himself with the stiller spirits in his own parish, who had grown up in and after his own fashion. Another dreadful winter settled down on Appasset Township. There was food enough in the house and firewood in the shed, but neither food nor fire seemed to assuage the terrible cold, and with decreased vitality, decreased courage came to all. Hygienics were an unforeseen mystery to people of that day. They did not know that nourishing food is as good for the brain as for the muscles. They lived on potatoes, beets, beans, with now and then a bit of salt pork or beef boiled in the pot with the rest, and their hearts failed, as their flesh did, with this sodden and monotonous diet. One ghastly night Hannah almost despaired. She held secret counsel with Dolly and Eben while they inspected the potato bin and the pork barrel, as to whether it would not be best for them to break up and find homes elsewhere for the winter. Her father was old and feeble. He would be glad to have her with him and Betty. The rest were old enough to do chores for their board, and there were many families where help was needed, both in Nepash and Litchfield, since every available man had gone to war by this time. But while they talked, a great scuffling and squawking in the woodhouse attracted the boys upstairs. Joe seized the tongs and Diana the broomstick. An intruding weasel was pursued and slaughtered, but not till 2 fowls, fat and fine, had been sacrificed by the invader and the tongs together. The children were all hungry with the exhaustion of the cold weather, and clamored to have these victims cooked for supper. Nor was Hannah unmoved by the appeal. Her own appetite seconded. The savory stew came just in time. It roused them to new life and spirits. Hannah regained courage, wondering how she could have lost heart so far, and said to Dolly, as they washed up the supper dishes, "I guess we'll keep together, Dolly. It'll be spring after a while, and we'll stick it out together." "I guess I would," answered Dolly. "And don't you believe we should all feel better to kill off them fowls, all but 2 or 3? They're master hands to eat corn, and it does seem as though that biled hen done us all a sight of good tonight. Just hear them children." And it certainly was, as Hannah said, musical to hear 'em. Joe had a cornstalk fiddle, and Eben an old singing book, which Diana read over his shoulder while she kept on knitting her blue sock, and the 3 youngsters, Sam, Obed, and Betty, with wide mouths and intent eyes,
followed Diana's lining out of that quaint hymn, The Old Israelites, dwelling with special gusto and power on 2 of the verses. We are little, 'tis true, and our numbers are few, and the sons of old Anak are tall, but while I see a track, I will never go back, but go on at the risk of my all. The way is all new as it opens to view, and behind is the foaming Red Sea. So no one need to speak of the onions and leeks, or talk about garlics to me. Hannah's face grew brighter still. We'll stay right here, she said, adding her voice to the singular old ditty with all her power. What though some in the rear preach up terror and fear, and complain of the trials they meet, though the giants before with great fury do roar, I'm resolved I can never retreat. And in this spirit, sustained no doubt by the occasional chickens, they lived the winter out, till blessed, beneficent spring came again, and brought news, great news, with it. Not from the army, though. There had been a post rider in Nepash during the January thaw, and he brought short letters only. There was about to be a battle, and there was no time to write more than assurances of health and good hopes for the future. Only once since had news reached them from that quarter. A disabled man from the Nepash company was brought home dying with consumption. Hannah felt almost ashamed to rejoice in the tidings he brought of John's welfare, when she heard his husky voice, saw his worn and ghastly countenance, and watched the suppressed agony in his wife's eyes. The words of thankfulness she wanted to speak would have been so many stabs in that woman's breast. It was only when her 8 children rejoiced in the hearing that she dared to be happy. But the other news was from Sylvia. She was promised to the schoolmaster in Litchfield. Only to think of it, our Sylvie! Master Loomis had been eager to go to the war, but his mother was a poor bedrid woman, dependent on him for support, and all the dignitaries of the town combined in advising and urging him to stay at home for the sake of their children as well as his mother. So at home he stayed, and fell into peril of heart instead of life and limb, under the soft fire of Sylvia's eyes instead of the enemy's artillery. Parson Everett could not refuse his consent, though he and Madam were both loath to give up their sweet daughter. But since she and the youth seemed to be both of one mind about the matter, and he, being a godly young man of decent parentage and in a good way of earning his living, there was no more to be said. They would wait a year before thinking of marriage, both for better acquaintance and on account of the troubled times.
"Mayhap the times will mend, sir," anxiously suggested the schoolmaster to Parson Everett. I think not, Master Loomis. There is a great blackness of darkness in hand, the Philistines be upon us, and there is moving to and fro. Yea, Behemoth lifteth himself, and shaketh his mane. It is not a time for marrying and giving in marriage, for playing on sackbuts and dulcimers.
A quiet smile flickered around Master Loomis's mouth as he turned away, solaced by a shy, sweet look from Sylvia's limpid eyes as he peeped into the keeping-room where she sat with Madam on his way out. He could afford to wait a year for such a spring blossom as that, surely. And wait he did, with commendable patience, comforting his godly soul with the fact that Sylvia was spared, meantime, the daily tendance and care of a fretful old woman like his mother. For though Master Loomis was the best of sons, that did not blind him to the fact that the irritability of age and illness were fully developed in his mother, and he alone seemed to have the power of calming her. She liked Sylvia at first, but became frantically jealous of her as soon as she suspected her son's attachment. So the summer rolled away. Hannah and her flock tilled their small farm, and gathered plenteous harvest. Mindful of last year's experience, they raised brood after brood of chickens and planted extra acres of corn for their feeding, so that when autumn came, with its vivid, splendid days, its keen winds and turbulent skies, the new chicken yard, which the boys had worked at through the summer, with its wattled fence, its own tiny spring, and lofty covered roofs, swarmed with chickens, ducks, and turkeys. Many a dollar was brought home about Thanksgiving time for the fat fowls sold in Litchfield and Nepash. But dollars soon vanished in buying winter clothes for so many children, or rather in buying wool to spin and weave for them. Michele Green, the village tailoress, came to fashion the garments, and the girls sewed them. Uncouth enough was their aspect, but fashion did not yet reign in Nepash, and if they were warm, who cared for elegance? Not Hannah's rosy, hearty, happy brood. They sang and whistled and laughed with a force and freedom that was kin to the birds and squirrels among whom they lived. And Hannah's kindly, cheery face lit up as she heard them, while a half sigh told her that her husband and her soldier boys still were wanting to her perfect contentment. At last they were all housed snugly for winter. The wood pile was larger than ever before, and all was laid up in the shed, beyond which a rough shelter of chinked logs had been put up for the chickens, to which their roosts and nest boxes of coarse wicker, boards nailed together, hollow bark from the hemlock logs, even worn-out tin pails, had all been transferred. The cellar had been well banked from the outside, and its darksome cavern held good store of apples, pork, and potatoes. There was dried beef in the stairway, squashes in the cupboard, flour in the pantry, and the great gentle black cow in the barn was a wonderful milker. In 3 weeks Thanksgiving would come, and even Hannah's brave heart sank as she thought of her absent husband and boys, and their weary faces rose up before her as she numbered over to herself her own causes for thankfulness, as if to say, "Can you keep Thanksgiving without us?" Poor Hannah! She did her best to set these thankless thoughts aside, but almost dreaded the coming festival. One night, as she sat knitting by the fire, a special messenger from Litchfield rode up to the door and brought stirring news. Master Loomis's mother was dead, and the master himself, seeing there was a new levy of troops, was now going to the war. But before he went there was to be a wedding, and in the good fashion it should be on Thanksgiving Day, and Madam Everett had bidden as many of Sylvie's people to the feast as would come. There was great excitement as Hannah read aloud the madam's note. The tribe of Perkins shouted for joy, but a sudden chill fell on them when Mother spoke. "Now, children, hush up. I want to speak myself, if it's a possible thing to get in a word edgeways. We can't all go, fust and foremost. 'Tain't no ways possible."
Oh, Mother, why? Oh, do not go to Sylvie's wedding,
burst in the infinite deep chorus of youngsters. "No, you can't. There ain't no team in the county big enough to hold all ye if you squeeze ever so much. I've got to go, for Sylvie'd be beat out if Mother didn't come, and Dolly's the oldest. She's got a right to go." Loud protest was made against the right of primogeniture, but Mother was firm. "Says so in the Bible. Leastways Bible folks always acted so. The firstborn, you know. Dolly's going sure. Eben's got to drive, and I must take Obed. He'd be the death of somebody with his everlasting mischief if I left him to home. Maybe I can squeeze in Betty to keep him company. Joe and Sam and Diana won't be more'n enough to take care of the cows and chickens and fires and all, likewise of each other." Sam set up a sudden howl at his sentence, and kicked the mongrel yellow puppy who leaped on him to console him, till that long-suffering beast yelped in concert. Diana sniffed and snuffled, scrubbed her eyes with her checked apron, and rocked back and forth. "Now stop it," bawled Joe. "For the land's sake, quit all this noise. We can't all on us go, and for my part, I don't want to. We'll have a wedding of our own some day." And here he gave a sly look at Dolly, who seemed to understand it and blushed like an apple blossom, while Joe went on. "Then we'll all stay to it, I tell ye, and have a right down old country time." Mother had to laugh. "So you shall, Joe, and dance monkey musk all night if you want to, same as you did to the corn huskin'. Now let's see. Betty, she's got that chintz gown that was your Sunday best, Dolly, the flowered one, you know, that Diana outgrowed. We must fix them lawn ruffles onto it, and there's a blue ribbon laid away in my chest of drawers that'll tie her hair. It's dreadful lucky we've got new shoes all round, and Obie's coat and breeches is as good as new if they be made out of Pa's wedding suit. That's a good cloth. It'll last most forever. Joe hit 'em first, then Sam wore 'em quite a spell, and they cut over just right for Obie. My black paduasoy can be fixed up, I guess. But my stars, Dolly, what have you got?" "Well, Mother, you know I ain't got a real good gown. There's the black lutestring petticoat Sylvie fetched me 2 years ago, but there ain't any gown to it. We calculated I could wear that linsey jacket to meeting under my coat, but 'twouldn't do rightly for a wedding." "That's gospel truth. You can't wear that anyhow. You got to have something. 'Twon't do to go to Sylvie's wedding in linsey woolsey. But I don't believe there's more'n $200 in the house. There's a few continentals, but I don't count on them. Joe, you go over to the mill first thing in the morning and ask Sylvester to lend me his old mare a spell tomorrow to ride over to Janaketch to the store." "Why don't you send Doll?" asked Joe with a wicked glance at the girl that set her blushing again. "Hold your tongue, Joseph, and mind me. It's bedtime now. I'll wake ye up early," energetically remarked Hannah, and next day, equipped in cloak and hood, she climbed the old mare's fat sides and jogged off on her errand, and by noon mark was safe and sound home again, looking a little perplexed, but by no means cast down. "Well, Dolly," said she, as soon as cloak and hood were laid aside, "there's the beautifulest piece of chintz over to the store you ever see. Just enough for a gown. It's kind of buff-colored ground, flowered all over with roses, deep red roses, as natural as life. Square Dart wouldn't take no money for it. He's awful sharp about them new bills. Says they ain't no more'n corn husks. Well, we ain't got a lot of 'em, so there's less to lose, and some folks will take 'em. But he'll let me have the chintz for 11 yards of soldier's cloth, blue, you know, like what we sent Pa and the boys. And I spent those $2 silver on a white gauze neckercher and a piece of red satin ribbon for ye, and I'm set on that chintz. Now hurry up and fix the loom right off. The web's ready, then we'll card the wool. I'll lay ye a penny we'll have them 11 yards wove by Friday. Today's Tuesday. Thanksgiving comes a Thursday week, and if we had the chintz by sundown of Saturday, there'll be a good store of time for Michele Green and you to make it afore Wednesday night. We'll have a kind of Thanksgiving after all. But I wish your Pa—" The sentence ended in Hannah's apron at her eyes, and Dolly looked sober. But in a minute she dimpled and brightened, for the pretty chintz gown was more to her than half a dozen costly French dresses to a girl of today. But a little cloud suddenly put out the dimples. "But, Mother, if somebody else should buy it—" "Oh, they won't. I fixed that. I promised to fetch the cloth inside of a week, and Squire Dart laid away the chintz for me till that time. Fetch the wool, Dolly, before you set up the web, so's I can start." The wool was carded, spun, washed, and put into the dye tub. One run of yarn that night, and another spun and washed by next day's noon, for the stuff was to be checked, and black wool needed no dyeing. Swiftly hummed the wheel, merrily flew the shuttle, and the house steamed with inodorous dye. But nobody cared for that, if the cloth could only be finished. And finished it was, the full measure and a yard over. And on Saturday morning Sylvester's horse was borrowed again, and Hannah came back from the village beaming with pleasure, and bringing besides the chintz a yard of real cushion lace to trim the ruffles for Dolly's sleeves, for which she had bartered the over yard of cloth and 24 fresh eggs. Then even busier times set in. Michele Green had already arrived, for she was a dressmaker as well as a tailoress, and was sponging and pressing over the black paduasoy that had once been dove-colored, and was Hannah's sole piece of wedding finery, handed down from her grandmother's wardrobe at that. A dark green grosgrain petticoat and white lawn ruffles made a sufficiently picturesque attire for Hannah, whose well-silvered hair set off her still sparkling eyes and clear, healthy skin. She appeared in this unwonted finery on Thanksgiving morning to her admiring family, having added a last touch of adornment by a quaint old jet necklace that glittered on the pure lawn neckerchief with as good effect as a chain of diamonds and much more fitness. Betty, in her striped blue and white chintz, a clean dimity petticoat, and a blue ribbon round her short brown curls, looked like a cabbage rosebud, so sturdy and wholesome and rosy that no more delicate symbol suits her. Obed was dreadful in the old-fashioned costume of coat and breeches, ill-fitting and shiny with wear, and his freckled face and round shock head of tan-colored hair thrown into full relief by a big square collar of coarse tatten lace laid out on his shoulders like a barber's towel, and illustrating the great red ears that stood out at right angles above it. But Obed was only a boy. He was not expected to be more than clean and speechless, and to tell the truth, Eben, being in the hobble-de-hoy stage of boyhood, gaunt, awkward, and self-sufficient, rather surpassed his small brother in unpleasant aspect and manner. But who would look at the boys when Dolly stood beside them, as she did now, tall and slender, with the free grace of an untrammeled figure, her small head erect, her eyes dark and soft as a deer's, neatly clothed feet, not too small for her height, peeping from under the black lute-string petticoat, and her glowing brunette complexion set off by the picturesque buff and garnet chintz gown, while her round throat and arms were shaded by delicate gauze and snowy lace, and about her neck lay her mother's gold beads, now and then tangling in the heavy black curls that, tied high on her head with a garnet ribbon, still dropped in rich luxuriance to her trim waist. The family approved of Dolly, no doubt, though their phrases of flattery were as homely as heartfelt. "Orful slick looking, ain't she?" confided Joe to Eben, while sinful Sam shrieked out, "Land o' Goshen, ain't our Dolly smart? Shan't I fetch Sylvester over?" For which I regret to state Dolly smartly boxed his ears. But the pung was ready, and Sam's howls had to die out uncomforted. With many parting charges from Hannah about the fires and fowls, the cow, the hasty pudding already put on for its long boil, and the turkey that hung from a string in front of the fire and must be watched well, since it was the Thanksgiving dinner, the weddingers, as Joe called them, were well packed in with blankets and hot stones and set off on their long drive. The day was fair and bright, the fields of snow purely dazzling, but the cold was fearful, and in spite of all their wraps, the keen winds that whistled over those broad hilltops where the road lay seemed to pierce their very bones, and they were heartily glad to draw up by 12 o'clock at the door of the parsonage and be set before a blazing fire, and revived with sundry mugs of foaming and steaming flip made potent with a touch of old peach brandy. For in those ancient days, even in parsonages, the hot poker knew its office, and sideboards were not in vain. There was food also for the exhausted guests, though the reflection was slight and served informally in the kitchen corner, for the ceremonial Thanksgiving dinner was to be deferred till after the wedding. And as soon as all were warmed and refreshed, they were ushered into the grand parlor, where a Turkey carpet, amber satin curtains, spider-legged chairs and tables, and a vast carved sofa, cushioned also with amber, made a regal and luxurious show in the eyes of our rustic observers. But when Sylvie came in with the parson, who could look at the furniture? Madam Everett had lavished her taste and her money on the lovely creature, as if she were her own daughter, for she was almost as dear to that tender child of soul. The girl's lustrous gold-brown hair was dressed high upon her head in soft puffs and glittering curls, and a filmy thread-lace scarf pinned across it with pearl-headed pins. Her white satin petticoat showed its rich luster under a lute-string gown of palest rose brocaded with silver sprigs and looped with silver ribbon and pink satin roses. Costly lace hung about her neck and arms. Long kid gloves covered her little hands and wrists and met the delicate sleeve rustles, and about her white throat a great pink topaz clasped a single string of pearls. Hannah could scarce believe her eyes. Was this her Sylvie? She, who even threw Madam Everett with her velvet dress, powdered hair, and Michelin laces quite into the background. "I do not like it, mammy dear," whispered Sylvie as she clung around her astonished mother's neck. "I wanted a muslin gown, but Madam had laid this by long ago, and I could not thwart or grieve her. She is so very good to me." "No more you could, Sylvie. The gown is amazing fine to be sure, but as long as my Sylvie's inside of it, I won't gainsay the gown. It ain't a speck too pretty for the wearer, dear." And Hannah gave her another hug. The rest scarce dared to touch that fair face, except Dolly, who threw her arms about her beautiful sister with little thought of her garments, but a sudden passion of love and regret sending the quick blood to her dark brows and wavy hair in a scarlet glow. Master Loomis looked on with tender eyes. He felt the usual masculine conviction that nobody loved Sylvie anywhere near as much as he did, but it pleased him to see that she was dear to her family. The parson, however, abruptly put an end to the scene. "My dear friends, let us recollect ourselves. There is a time for all things. Yea, earth yieldeth her increase. The Lord ariseth to shake visibly the earth. Sylvia, will you stand before the Sophie? Master Loomis on the right side. Let us pray." But even as he spoke the words, a great knocking pealed through the house. The brass lion's head on the front door beat a reveille loud and long. The parson paused, and Sylvia grew whiter than before, while Decius, the parson's factotum, a highly respectable old negro, who with his wife and daughter, sole servants of the house, had stolen in to see the ceremony, ambled out to the vestibule in most undignified haste. There came sounds of dispute, much trampling of boots, rough voices, and quick words. Then a chuckle from Decius. The parlor door burst open, and 3 bearded, ragged, eager men rushed in upon the little ceremony. There was a moment's pause of wonder and doubt. Then a low cry from Hannah as she flew into her husband's arms, and in another second the whole family had closed around the father and brothers, and for once the hardy, stern, reticent New England nature, broken up from its foundations, disclosed its depths of tenderness and fidelity. There were tears, choking sobs, cries of joy. The madam held her lace handkerchief to her eyes with real need of it, and Master Loomis choked for sympathy, and the parson blew his nose on the ceremonial bandana like the trumpet of a cavalry charge. "Let us pray," said he in a loud but broken voice, and holding fast to the back of the chair, he poured out his soul and theirs before the Lord with all the fervor and the fluency of real feeling. There was no stumbling over misapplied texts now, no awkward objections in his throat, but only glowing Bible words of thankfulness and praise and joy. And every heart was uplifted and calm as they joined in the Amen. John's story was quickly told. Their decimated regiment was disbanded to be reformed of fresh recruits, and a long furlough given to the faithful but exhausted remnant. They had left at once for home, and their shortest route lay through Litchfield. Night was near when they reached the town, but they must needs stop to get one glimpse of Sylvie and tidings from home, for fear lay upon them lest there might be trouble there which they knew not of. So they burst in upon the wedding, but Master Loomis began to look uneasy. Old Dorcas had slipped out to save the imperiled dinner, and Pokey, the maid, nay, Pocahontas, could be heard clinking glass and silver and pushing about chairs. But the happy family were still absorbed in each other. "Mr. Everett," said the madam with dignity, and the little minister trotted rapturously over to her chair to receive certain low orders. "Yes, verily, yes. Ah, my friends, we are assembled in this place this evening." A sharp look from madam recalled him to the fact that this was not a prayer meeting.
That is, yes, of a truth, our purpose this afternoon was to—" "That's so," energetically put in Captain John. "Right about face, form," and the three Continentals sprung to their feet and assumed their position, while Sylvie and Master Loomis resumed theirs, a flitting smile in Sylvia's tearful eyes making a very rainbow. So the ceremony proceeded to the end, and was wound up with a short prayer, concerning which Captain Perkins irreverently remarked to his wife some days later, "Parson smelt the turkey sure as shooting, Hannah. He shortened up so amazing quick on that prayer, I tell you I was glad on it. I knew how he felt. I could have ate a wolf myself." Then they all moved in to the dinner table, a strange group, from Sylvia's satin and pearls to the ragged fatigue dress of her father and brothers. But there was no help for that now, and really it troubled nobody. The shade of anxiety in Madam's eye was caused only by a doubt as to the sufficiency of her supplies for 3 unexpected and ravenous guests. But a look at the mighty turkey, the crisp roast pig, the cold ham, the chicken pie, and the piles of smoking vegetables, with a long vista of various pastries, apples, nuts, and pitchers of cider on the buffet, and an inner consciousness of a big Indian pudding for 24 hours simmering in the pot over the fire, reassured her, and perhaps heartened up the parson, for after a long grace he still kept his feet, and added with a kindly smile, "Brethren and friends, you are heartily welcome. Eat and be glad, for seldom hath there been such cause and need to keep a thanksgiving." And they all said, "Amen." End of an old-fashioned Thanksgiving.
Section 31 of Good Cheer Stories Every Child Should Know. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Kasper. Good Cheer Stories Every Child Should Know by Asa Don Dickinson. 1800 and Froze to Death by C.A. Stevens. An exciting story of a battle with a crazy moose. It has a Thanksgiving flavor, too. What shall we have for Thanksgiving dinner?
was a question which distressed more than one household that year. Indeed, it was often a question what to have for dinner, supper, or breakfast on any day. For that was the strangely unpropitious, unproductive season of 1816, quaintly known in the local annals as 1800 and froze to death. It was shortly after the close of the War of 1812 with England. Our country was then poor and but little cultivated. There was no Golden West to send carloads of wheat and corn, no Florida or California to send fruit. There were no cars, no railroads. What the people of the eastern states had, they must raise for themselves, and that year there were no crops. Nothing grew, nothing ripened properly. Winter lingered even in the lap of May. As late as the middle of June, there was a heavy snowstorm in New England. Frosts occurred every fortnight of the season. The seed potatoes, corn, and beans, when planted, either rotted in the ground or came up to be killed by the frost. The cold continued through July and August. A little barley, still less wheat and rye, a few oats in favorable situations, were the only cereals harvested, and these were much pinched in the kernel. Actual starvation threatened hundreds of farmers' families as this singular summer and autumn advanced. The corn crop, then the main staple in the East, was wholly cut off. $2 and $3 a bushel, equal to $10 today, were paid for corn that year by those who had the money to purchase it. Many of the poorer families subsisted in part on the boiled sprouts of raspberry and other shrubs. Starving children stole forth into the fields of the less indigent farmers by night and dug up the seed potatoes and sprouted corn to eat raw. Moreover, there appeared to be little or no game in the forest. Many roving bears were seen, and wolves were bold. All wild animals, indeed, behaved abnormally, as if they too felt that nature was out of joint. The eggs of the grouse or partridge failed to hatch. Even woodchucks were lean and scarce. So of the brooding hens at the settler's barn. The eggs would not hatch, and the hens, too, it is said, gave up laying eggs, perhaps from lack of food. Even the songbirds fell into the dumps and neglected to rear young. The dreary, fruitless autumn drew on, and Thanksgiving Day bade fair to be such a hollow mockery that in several states the governors did not issue proclamations. Maine, at that time, was a part of the state of Massachusetts. My impression is that the governor appointed November 28th as Thanksgiving Day, but I am not sure. It is likely that not much unction attended the announcement. The notices of it did not reach many localities in Maine. In the neighborhood where my grandparents lived, in Oxford County, nothing was heard of it. But at a schoolhouse meeting on November 21st, our nearest neighbor, Jonas Edwards, made a motion that the people of the place keep the 28th of the month as Thanksgiving Day as best they could. The motion prevailed, and then the poor housewives began to ask the question, "What shall we have for Thanksgiving dinner?" At our house it is still remembered that one of my young great-uncles cried in reply, "Oh, if only we could have a good big Johnny cake!" And it was either that very night or the night after that the exciting news came of the arrival of a shipload of corn at Bath and Brunswick. At Brunswick, seat of the then infant Bowdoin College, Freeport, Topsham, and other towns near the coast of Maine, where the people were interested in maritime ventures, it had become known that a surplus of corn was raised in Cuba and could be purchased at a fair price. An old schooner, commanded by one Captain John Simmons, was fitted out to sail for a cargo of the precious cereal. For 3 months not a word was heard from schooner or skipper. Captain Simmons had purchased corn, however, and loaded his crazy old craft full to the deck with it. Heavy weather and head winds held him back on his voyage home. Water got to the corn, and some of it swelled to such an extent that the old schooner was like to burst. But it got in at last, early in November, with 3,000 bushels of West India corn. How the news of this argosy flew, even to towns a day's journey up from the coast. A great hunger for corn cake swept through that part of the state, and in our own little neighborhood a searching canvass of the resources of the 5 log farmhouses followed. As a result of it, young Jonathan Edwards and my then equally youthful great-uncle Nathaniel set off the next day to drive to Brunswick with a span of old white horses hitched in a farm wagon without springs, carrying 4 rather poor sheep, 4 bushels of barley, and 15 pounds of wool, which they hoped to exchange for 5 bushels of that precious corn. On top of it all there were 3 large bagfuls of hay for the horses. The boys also took an axe and an old flintlock gun, for much of the way was then through forest. It was a long day's drive for horses in poor condition, but they reached Brunswick that night. There, however, they found the cargo of corn so nearly sold out or bartered away that they were able to get but 3 bushels to bring home. The corn was reckoned at $9, the 4 sheep only at $6, and it had been difficult dickering the 15 pounds of wool and the 2 bushels of barley as worth $3 more. The extra 2 bushels of barley went for their keep overnight. Such was the produce exchange in 1816. The next morning they started for home, lightly loaded with their dearly bought corn. Their route lay along the Androscoggin River, and they had got as far on their way as the present factory town of Auburn, where the little Androscoggin flows into the larger river of the same name, when they had an adventure which resulted in very materially increasing the weight of their load. It was a raw, cloudy day, and had begun to spit snow, and as it drew toward noon they stopped beside the road, at a place where a large pine and several birches leaned out from the brink of the deep gorge through which the little Androscoggin flows to join the larger stream. Here they fed their horses on the last of the 3 bagfuls of hay, but had nothing to cook or eat in the way of food themselves. The weather was chilly, and my young great-uncle Nathaniel said to Jonathan, "If you will get some dry birch bark, I will flash the pan. We will kindle a fire and warm up." Jonathan brought the bark, and meanwhile Nathaniel drew the charge from the old Queen's arm, then ignited some powder in the pan with the flintlock, and started a blaze going. The blaze, however, had soon to be fed with dry fuel, and noticing a dead fir top lying on the ground a few steps away, Jonathan took the axe and ran to break it up, and the axe strokes among the dry stuff made a considerable crackling. Throwing down the axe at last, Jonathan gathered up a large armful of the dry branches, and had turned to the fire, when they both heard a strange sound, like a deep grunt, not far away, followed by sharp crashes of the brush down in the basin. "What's that?" Nathaniel exclaimed. "It's a bear, I guess," and he snatched up the empty gun to reload it. Jonathan, too, threw down his armful of boughs and turned back to get the axe. Before they could do either, however, the strange grunts and crashes came nearer, and a moment later a pair of broad antlers and a huge black head appeared, coming up from the gorge. At the sight of the snorting beast, Jonathan turned suddenly. "It's a moose, Nat!" he cried. "A big bull moose! Shoot him! Shoot him!" Nat was making frantic efforts, but the gun was not reloaded. Recharging an old Queen's arm was a work of time. Fortunately for the boys, the attention of the moose was full fixed on the horses. With another furious snort, it gained the top of the bank and bounded toward where they stood hitched, chewing their hay. The tired white horses looked up suddenly from their hay, and, perceiving this black apparition of the forest, snorted and tugged at their halters. With a frightful bellow, half squeal, half roar, the moose rose 12 feet tall on his hind legs and rushed at the one hitched nearest. The horse broke its halter, ran headlong against its mate, recoiled, bumped into a tree trunk, and then, the trees standing thick in front of it, backed over the bank and went out of sight down the bluff, the moose bounding after it, still bellowing hoarsely. The other horse had also broken its halter and ran off, while the two boys stood amazed and alarmed at this tremendous exhibition of animal ferocity. "Nat, Nat, he will kill that horse!" Jonathan exclaimed, and they both ran to look over the bank. Horse and moose were now down near the water, where the river ran deep and swift under the steep bank, the horse trying vainly to escape through the tangled alder brush, the moose savagely pursuing. The sight roused the boys to save their horse. Axe in hand, Jonathan ran and slid down the bluff side, catching hold of trees and bushes as he did so to keep from going quite into the river. Nat followed him with the gun which he had hastily primed. Both horse and moose were now thrashing amidst the alder clumps. Shoot him! Jonathan shouted. "Why don't you fire? Oh, let me have that gun!" It is not as easy as an onlooker often thinks to shoot an animal, even a large one, in rapid motion, particularly among trees and brush. Something constantly gets in the way. Both animals were now tearing along the brink of the deep stream, stumbling headlong one second, up the next, plunging on. As often as Nat tried to steady himself on the steep side of the bluff for a shot, either the horse was in the way, or both animals were wholly concealed by the bushes. Moreover, the boys had to run fast through the brush to keep them in sight. Nat could not shoot with certainty, and Jonathan grew wild over the delay. "Shoot him yourself, then," Nat retorted, panting. Jonathan snatched the gun and dashed forward, Nat picking up the axe and following after. On they ran for several 100 yards, barely keeping pace with the animals. Jonathan experienced quite as much difficulty in getting a shot as Nat had done. At last he aimed and snapped, and the gun did not go off. "You never primed it!" he exclaimed indignantly. Nat thought he had done so, but was not wholly certain, and feeling that he must do his part somehow, he now dashed past Jonathan, and, running on, attempted to head the horse off at a little gully down the bank to which they had now come. It was a brushy place. He fell headlong into it himself, and rolled down, still grasping hard at the axe. He was close upon the horse now, within a few yards of the water, and looking up, he saw the moose's head among the alder brush. The creature appeared to be staring at him, and regaining his feet, much excited, Nat threw the axe, with all his strength, at the moose's head. By chance, rather than skill, the pole of the axe struck the animal just above the eyes at the root of the antlers. It staggered, holding its head to one side a moment as if half stunned or in pain. Then, recovering, it snorted, and with a bound through the brush jumped into the stream, and either swam or waded across to the low sandy bank on the other side. There it stood, still shaking its head. Jonathan had caught up with Nat by this time, and they both stood watching the moose for some moments, hoping that the mad animal had now had enough of the fracas and would go his way. The horse was in the brush of the little gully, sticking fast there, or tired out by its exertions, and they now began considering how they could best extricate it and get it back up the bluff. Just then, however, their other horse neighed, long and shrill, from the top of the bank, calling to its mate. The frightened horse beside them neighed back in reply. These equine salutations produced an unexpected result. Another hoarse snort and a splash of the water was the response from across the stream. "He's coming again!" exclaimed Jonathan. "Have you got the powder horn, Nat? Give it to me quick, if you've got it." Nathaniel had the powder horn up on the bank, but had dropped it there, or lost it out of his pocket in his scramble down the bluff. There was no time to search for it. The moose was plunging through the narrow stream, and a moment later sprang ashore and came bounding up the gully toward the horse. The boys shouted to frighten him off. The crazy creature appeared neither to hear nor heed. Jonathan hastily took refuge behind a rock. Nat jumped to the cover of a tree trunk. In his rush at the horse, the moose passed close to them. Again Nat hurled the axe at the animal's side. Jonathan, snatching up a heavy stone, threw it with all his might. The horse, too, wheeling in the narrow bed of the gully, kicked spitefully, lashing out its iron-shod hoofs again and again, planting them hard on the moose's front. For some moments this singular combat raged there. Recovering the axe and coming up behind the animal, Nat now attempted to deal a blow. The moose wheeled, however, as if struck by sudden panic, and went clear over Nat, who was thrown headlong and slid down into the water. The moose bounded clear over him, and again went splashing through the little Androscoggin to the other side, where it turned as before, shaking its antlers and rending the brush with them. Nathaniel had caught hold of a bush, and thus saved himself from going fully into the swift current. Jonathan helped him get out, and the two young fellows stared at each other. The encounter had given them proof of the mad strength and energy of the moose. "Oh, if only we could find that powder horn somewhere!" Jonathan exclaimed. The horse up on the bluff sent forth again its shrill neigh, to which the one beside them responded. And just as before, the moose, with an awful bellow, came plunging through the little river and bounding up the gully. "My soul, here he comes again!" Jonathan fairly yelled. "Get out of the way!" And Nat got out of the way as quickly as possible, taking refuge behind the same rock and the side of the gully. Again the place resounded to a frightful medley of squeals, bellowings, and crashes in the brush. This time Jonathan had caught up the axe, and approaching the furious melee of whirling hoofs and gnashing teeth from one side, attempted to get in a blow. In their wild movements the enraged animals nearly ran over him, but he struck and stumbled. The blow missed the moose's head, but fell on the animal's foreleg, just below the knee, and broke the bone. The moose reared, and wheeling on its hind legs, plunged down the gully, falling partly into the river, much as Nat had done. A dozen times it now struggled to get up, almost succeeding, but fell back each time. With the ardor of battle still glowing in him, Jonathan rushed forward with the axe, and finally managed to deal the moose a death blow. With a knife they then bled it, and stood by triumphant. "We've muttoned him! We've muttoned him!" Nat shouted. "But I never had such a fight as that before." The horse, as it proved, was not seriously injured, but they were obliged to cut away the alder brush in the gully to get the animal back up the bluff, and were fully occupied for an hour doing so. The body of the moose was a huge one. It must have weighed fully 1,400 pounds. The boys could no more have moved it than they could move a mountain. Moreover, it was now beginning to snow, fine and fast. Jonathan had a fairly good knife, however, and by using the knife they succeeded in rudely butchering the carcass and dismembering it. Even then the quarters were so heavy that their full strength was required to drag them up the bluff and load them into the wagon. The head, with its broad branching antlers, was all that they could lift to the top of their now bulky load. The task had taken till past 4 o'clock of that stormy November afternoon. Twilight was upon them, the wintry twilight of a snowstorm, before they made their start, and it was long past midnight when they finally plodded home. There were corn cake and moose venison for Thanksgiving dinner. End of 1800 and Froze to Death